Okay, continuing with juries, we're going to talk about jury consulting a little bit, litigation psychology. So jury consulting started out with people who were trying to organize either the trial itself, structure the trial so that it was easy for the jury to understand, or being a litigation or consultant to say things like how you should best present evidence, what you should wear, those kinds of things, okay? And so the American Society of Trial Consultants started in 1982 with 15 members, and today it is just a huge application of psychology and law. And it wasn't only psychologists that started doing this, it was also FBI agents and law enforcement types and social scientists and all kinds of things. So before it was like a something that wealthy people had an advantage of, so you could afford to hire a trial consultant, and it gave you an advantage. So they made themselves available to do that. But now it's very common to see this in court. Okay, so litigants with money make use of trial consulting. So what about how it works? So one of the most famous cases of early trial consulting was MCI and AT&T. So back in the day, AT&T was the only game in town. It was only AT&T. There was nothing else, and they called her Ma Bell. So Ma Bell basically had a monopoly on phone usage, and basically there was only a phone in your home. So as phone usage became more popular and we became more heavily dependent on phones and cell phones and things like that, other providers wanted to get in on the action. So MCI was the first one, and MCI started to sue AT&T, and they wanted a share of the phone lines and pathways that AT&T was using. So they decided to get trial consultants and see how best to convince jurors that AT&T was monopolizing the phone industry, and how to allow a share for MCI and other providers as well. So what they did was they practiced. They practiced by having mock jurors, and they would try the case, and they would try different strategies on these mock jurors to see how best to encapsulate the case to make it amenable to jurors. So when the mock jurors heard from MCI that, hey, AT&T is monopolizing and they should share the lines with competitors, jurors thought, no, AT&T was really good. But then when MCI, so that didn't really help them. So when MCI said, look, AT&T is a monopoly and that is illegal, and we'll show you how it's illegal, and your duty is to apply the law. When they appealed to the legalistic argument to jurors, that worked. Not only did that work with, the type of argument, but also with the damage award, okay? So damage awards were really interesting. MCI told the jurors that they had lost $100 million in profits because of AT&T being a monopoly. So the jury, when they asked the jury how much should they get, the jury awarded $100 million, exactly what they thought they would deserve, because they said that's what we lost and that's what we deserve. So they gave them the exact amount. However, when MCI bumped that up and said, we have lost $900 million, the second jury said, okay, we'll give you $900 million, which was pretty good, because when it got to the court and the judge looked at the facts of the case and saw that they were ready to give $900 million, the actual trial gave, and the jury gave $600 million. But when it came to punitive damages, to punish them for being a monopoly for so long and for trying to keep the competitors out, that translated in punitive damages, not just compensatory damages, to $1.8 billion, which was the highest award for a monopoly case ever. Okay, so it was as a result of trial consultant that they were able to see the usefulness of it in a courtroom. So that's why it's such a big deal now, and it's very lucrative. So you can get into that with forensic psychology degree if that's what you want to do all day, but you'll be running a lot of mock juries and doing a lot of research. So that's where your research comes in handy. So I'm going through the different parts of the things you have to know for jury, and we're going to go into chapter 10. I will put the chapters up in Moodle so that you can follow along and and read some of this stuff as well. And it's going to be chapter 6, chapter 10, and then the judge part of it, which I won't make a video on that part, but I am going to put it up, and I expect you to know it, so it will be on the final exam, so do read that. So let's start with the jury's decision. How do jurors make decision, okay? So first of all, remember I told you the qualifications of a jury. So juror competence is a really important thing. And that's where I started my research. And what I did was I used a toxic tort case, which was a sophisticated but complex case looking at how jurors understood evidence. And when I started doing that research, I decided to split people up into educational groups. So low, medium, and high levels of education. For the low group, it was up to a bachelor's degree. To the medium group, it was you had your bachelor's degree and you had a master's degree. And then the high group was you had a degree past that, some training after, some education after master's degree and up to PhD. And then I had a trial, that trial that I was talking about, and with the help of the law school and my mentor and some other individuals, we enlisted the help of the Toledo Repertory Company to reenact the case. We showed them, we had videotaped actually this, we had taped this trial that happened in Ohio, and it was very complex. It was a toxic tort case. It was the pollution of the Ohio River, which was terrible. A chemical company had a leak in their factory, and all the chemicals started going into the Ohio River. And people got sick, they were carcinogens, they got cancer, and they made a living off the Ohio River. They were catching fish, they were eating the fish, which also meant that they got sick, they got cancer, all that kind of stuff. And so they decided they were going to sue the company. Well, the company, of course, said, we're not doing anything wrong, which all the companies say. But nevertheless, they started in on this lawsuit. It was a very famous toxic tort case. So we took... myself, my mentor, and law professors, we took all the evidence from that case, every single piece of evidence, and there was a lot of evidence, and we coded it between probative value. Remember I told you probative means how relevant the piece of evidence is, non-probative means it's less relevant or circumstantial, and then extra evidentiary factors like, hey, nice suit, those kinds of things. And we wanted to see if people with low, medium, or high levels of education interpreted the evidence differently, and what we found was shocking. We found that people with, in really complex cases, people with higher levels of education were able to remember as much as 4 times as much probative evidence than people with master's and bachelor's degrees. Not only that, but the ratio of probative to non-probative to extra evidentiary was very striking. Okay, so we were looking at different things. Could they sort out the important information when they heard it? Did they know that this piece of evidence was more relevant than another piece of evidence? Would they use it when they started talking about it in their decisions? And also, could they separate things like who said what? So we had a bevy of just so many expert witnesses saying very complex things. We had epidemiologists testify about the development of cancer and the result of exposure to that chemical on the immune system and the effect on T cells, T helper cells, T suppressor cells, those kinds of things. So the evidence was very complex. And like I said, the people with the higher levels of education did much, much better. And there were striking and significant differences between low, medium, and high, between each one, high statistical differences. So that was really striking for us to find that out. So they could appropriately separate the evidence, and they remembered just more of it, sheer volumes of it. We also did things where we varied the type of evidence. We had, so all complex evidence. Complexity in terms of ambiguity. When you get 2 experts and this one says, yes, it causes cancer, and another person says, no, it doesn't cause cancer, and they're both experts, that makes it ambiguous. And what do people do? Is there a difference in ability to get through that between low, medium, and high educational levels? Then we had complexity in terms of volume. Usually toxic tort cases, there's a lot of information. There's just so much information, so many expert witnesses, so many pieces of evidence. So we wanted to see, well, if there was a lot of information, could they get through that better between low, medium, and high levels of education? And the third one was technological complexity. I told you about, an expert witness getting up there and talking about the development of immunological suppression on T cells, T helper cells, T suppressor cells, all of that kind of stuff, how carcinogens develop. That's technologically complex. And again, once again, we found differences between low, medium, and high levels of education. So yes, juror competence, it does make a difference who's on the jury. It does make a difference what their level of education is, and it does make a very striking difference on how they process that information. Ironically, that wasn't the end of the story, the end of the research, because I had this pocket of jurors who, they were like older people, senior citizens, and at the time they were like, World War II type people, And interestingly, a lot of those people did not have good levels of education. Some of them didn't even go to get a bachelor's degree. They just had their high school degree because that was the way it was in the time during World War II. But they did very well. Okay, they did really well. They performed like someone with a master's or a doctorate. And I was like, how is this possible? What is going on here? Then we figured it out. Okay, there's a variable called NCOG, and capital N dash capital C, capital O, capital G. Okay, NCOG. It stands for need for cognition. Okay, and we found this to be true. No matter what the age group is, people who measure high in the need for cognition will have the ability to understand and do well. So the people who, from World War II, who didn't go to college, it wasn't that they, had no interest or felt that they couldn't get a good education or were not worthy of a good education. Oh, they were. They just, because of different circumstances, didn't get to go to college. Maybe they came home from World War II and they had to, work to support a family or whatever, okay? They just didn't get to college. But that didn't mean that they stopped needing to think about things, to learn about things, to do things. They were just naturally curious, and they were very, very intelligent, and they had a really good level of processing information. That's because they never stopped learning, and they were dedicated to finding things out. They were high in the need to understand things, high in the need for cognition. So then I started doing research on people who were high versus low in the need for cognition, and I found out that true, no matter what your circumstances are, no matter what your age, your educational level, or anything, there is a striking difference between people with high NCOG and people with low NCOG. That it isn't necessarily about education. Now, education does foster need for cognition, so those two things are related, but the confound is to think that it's just education. It's not just education. Really, it is need for cognition, and people with higher levels of educational attainment tend to have the highest level in the need for cognition. They're just naturally curious and always trying to think about things. So that's the relationship there. So the research was really interesting that I found out about juries. I found out about toxic tort in legal cases, and then I found out some stuff about cognitive psychology as well. So it was like the trifecta of juror competence. So anyway, that's the first step in jury decision making, is to have a competent jury. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the structure of the jury in the next video.